the cloud. I just don't know which cloud they're referring to be honest. I always say the computer because I'm like, okay.
Well, let's see. I'm
but
going to
yeah,
record them.
You're going to record on your computer?
Yeah, I'll record on my computer as well, just in case.
Yeah, no, you can just send that to me at some point. Probably have to Dropbox or Google Drive it or something.
Like that. Got a few minutes. So.
Okay.
All right. Phil said he'll be joining. Oh, there he is.
Okay.
And Rom, Andrew. Give it just a few more minutes and then we'll start.
Okay. And Margot, do you know about the event, the children's event?
I do.
That Phil has advertised.
Yeah, won't you just send me the details again?
Okay, sure.
We can stick them in the chat and then I'll just have them.
Okay.
And then I'll just announce that at the end.
Yes. Perfect.
But there were a couple of others. There was the children's event, and then there was the stuff at the South African Cities Network Urban Festival.
Yes, is that one as well? I thought also actually spoke about that.
Sorry, Lene.
No, go ahead.
I'll put the link to the festival into the chat.
Okay, great.
And then Tammy's going to send a circular on events during the festival. I think she'll talk to you about it tomorrow. Events during the festival that's linked to partners, to FACE's partners. But I'll put the link through.
Okay, super. Okay, good. Okay, by my watch, it's 2 minutes past. Should we get going?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I've got a good
Good number, yeah.
Yeah. Bill, you ready?
Yeah, ready to go. Thanks, Margaret.
Right, let's go. Okay, we're going to begin. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this ad hoc Faces of the City on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. And this afternoon we have a very exciting presentation from Dylan Weekly, and it's entitled Updating the Johannesburg Spatial Development Framework, Engaging Academia. And as far as I'm aware, and Dylan I'm sure will tell us some more, this is in a series of engagements that the city is having about updating the spatial development framework, but I'm sure we'll get some more details. To give you a few more details about our presenter, it's Dylan Weekly, and he has been a strategic urban planner in the City of Johannesburg City Transformation and Spatial Planning Directorate for the last 5 years. And along with the Metro team, he is responsible for citywide spatial policies, including the SDF, inclusionary housing policy, and the nodal review. Before working at the city, Dylan was a researcher at Wits School of Architecture and Planning, and I was very lucky enough to share an office with him in our chair in the research chair in spatial analysis and city planning. And he also studied urban and regional planning at Wits, so he's a planner through and through. So, Dill, I'd like to welcome you, and you may start when you're ready.
Great. Thank you very much, Margot. Let me just share my screen here quickly. All right. Can I just ask, can you see that? And can
Yes, we can see that. Thanks, Dylan. That looks great.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So thank you very much, Margot, for organizing this session. And thanks very much to Lene as well for all the work in putting it all together.
You should concentrate and take notes. You know who's calling? Who's talking? I think I heard Neil.
Sorry, let me just. Okay, I'll carry on. So, sorry. Just okay. So again, thanks very much for the opportunity to present. So basically, just the objectives of what I'd like to go through in this presentation. So firstly, and obviously the SDF is 5 years old, and it was adopted in 2016. So we are updating it, the City of Joburg. Interestingly, just an aside, the Spluma doesn't actually give a date for municipalities to update SDFs. It gives times for national and provincial government to do it, which is every 5 years, but doesn't say for municipalities. So we've just assumed that it's 5 years for us. We're going to give I'm going to give a bit of background on the SDF. Sorry, a few things are popping up here on my screen. Background on the current SDF, just what the sort of current SDF says very broadly, something that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. Present a very broad outline of the plan to update the SDF. That's mainly just timelines, and we'll be doing that this financial year. And then most importantly, highlighted here, is to really gain feedback on what the SDF, on what the city should consider in updating the SDF. We haven't started doing any real work yet on updating the document. So we wanted to go out to the public and engage a whole lot of people and get ideas before we even start going. Otherwise, it just sort of ends up being us putting ideas down on paper and sending them out for comments, and that doesn't really create that much alignment. Just so you know as well, this is one of 6 sessions that we're having. We had one with, we've got 2 with developers and planning consultants, another one with government groups, another one with civil society and housing, and another one with environmental and heritage groups. And this is the academia one specifically. Okay, so very broadly, just what the SDF is. I know a lot of people are aware of this, but I think it's good to just quickly go through it. So firstly, the SDF, the Spatial Development Framework, is a policy, but it does have a very strong legislative backing. So this started in 2000 with the Municipal Systems Act, which really introduced and solidified that idea of SDFs, that municipalities must create them. That act also said that SDFs are part of the integrated development plan of municipalities. So that's a yearly plan, and then a yearly cross-sectoral plan, and then the SDF is the spatial component of that plan. So every year the SDF is included as a chapter in the IDP. Then in 2013, the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act came in, although a bit later with the regulations. And that really then gave more sort of impetus and solidified what the SDF should do. That's based on the Constitution, Section 156.1, which points to Part B, Schedule 4, which says municipal planning is obviously a municipal function. And that was really set down by the Constitutional Court in 2010 in City of Johannesburg versus the Gauteng Development Tribunal and others. And that really said that the cities and municipalities are responsible for land use decisions and land use planning. Before that, for example, you could appeal a land use decision up to province. A decision that was made by the city, you could approve it up to province, and things like Stain City and Waterfall Estate were actually examples of those kind of decisions, and that can no longer happen since 2010. Also, just to note that, you know, even though it is just a policy, it does have quite a serious weight. And the one example I just wanted to show here is Section 22.1 of SPLUMA, which says anyone making a land use decision cannot make a decision which is inconsistent with a municipal spatial development framework. So it's quite seriously written, you know, that a spatial development framework should guide all land use decisions in the city. Obviously, it has some caveats, but we can just skip over that for now. So also importantly, SPLUMA identifies a suite of documents that municipalities must put together to deal with land use planning. And those are just listed here. And this is included really just to show that we're going to be talking about the SDF today and not necessarily these other two things, although they are very important. So the first one is the land use scheme. And very basically, the scheme is the register of all land use rights in the city. For all land in the city. So every property you'll know has a zoning that's recorded in the land use scheme. And in the scheme are all the controls of what you can and can't do on land. Then there's the municipal planning bylaw. And this is a set of rules and procedures that the city's adopted as a bylaw that guides applications on how the land use scheme is amended. So if you want to change zoning, you would use the bylaw to tell you the procedure of how to amend the land use scheme. And that would be a rezoning or a township establishment or that sort of thing. And then lastly, the spatial development framework is the policy that's used to guide decisions on applications to amend the scheme. So you can see they are very closely related, but do each have their own specific function. And we'll be talking about the SDF today. So I'm going to go through this very quickly because it's the kind of thing, I did send the presentation to Margot and Lene, who can circulate it to everyone. So, and this is the kind of thing you can read up, but we did want to just list all the things that SPLUMA says we must do when putting together an SDF. So I'll go through it very quickly, but first is to give effect to the development principles in SPLUMA. I'll also summarize those later. Include a written spatial representation of the 5-year spatial development plan for the city. Include a longer-term spatial development vision. Our spatial development framework has 2040 at the end of it, so that sort of represents the kind of timescale we're looking at. Identify current and future significant structuring and restructuring elements. And for the planners, those are things like nodes, development corridors, that sort of thing, the urban development boundary. This is important for us to update, include population growth estimates for the next 5 years, include estimates for the demand for housing. It also has more detail saying that should be across all income groups. Include estimates of economic activity and employment trends, and identify, quantify, and provide location of engineering, of requirements for engineering infrastructure. And I think that H is very important because I believe that the SDF does two main things. First, it guides land use decisions. So if we just simplify it a lot, things like rezonings, etc. But it's also supposed to guide where the city invests. So the city's plus or minus 10 billion Rand capital budget every year gets determined at least partially by the SDF. Continued, these ones I'll go through very quickly. Identify the designated areas where national or provincial inclusionary housing policy may be applicable. That one we actually developed our own policy because there isn't a national or provincial one in place. And also, we believe inclusionary housing is a land use policy more than a housing policy. So we believe it should be a municipal function. Include a strategic assessment of environmental pressures and opportunities. Identify the designation of areas in the municipality where incremental upgrading approaches to development would be applicable. And that I'd like to discuss. I think that is a current limitation of our SDF. Identify the designation where more detailed local plans are needed and where possibly shortened land use development procedures may be applicable. Bring together all the different departments in the city, and a lot of the policies in the city aren't necessarily spatial. So try and give coordination to the spatial intent of all the policies in the city. This one, again, the same as on the last slide, number K. I think the second most important part of an SDF, or one of the two important parts of an SDF, is determine a capital expenditure framework for the city. This one is not so important in this case because we've already got a scheme in place and the scheme is quite new, but the SDF should identify areas where the scheme should be updated and then include an implementation plan. Okay, so let me just get this. I think it's a bit better, sorry. Excuse me, sorry, 1 second. Okay, so we also want to highlight that we believe the SDF is a living document, even though it gets adopted every 5 years or sometimes less frequently. Changes do get made to the SDF all the time. So the examples that most people are aware of are the inclusionary housing and the nodal review policies. So inclusionary housing was adopted last year in 2019, and the nodal review, which is arguably a very significant update to the SDF already, was adopted earlier this year. So already the SDF has changed in its 5-year lifespan. But then it also includes other small-scale policies that get developed all the time, and these get developed either by sort of community groups, by my directorate, which is city planning, or sometimes by other departments and entities, so and even other spheres of government. Although they all should be adopted and approved by the city to become city policy and part of the SDF. And these include strategic area frameworks. So the corridors of freedom are strategic area frameworks, precinct plans, which are for small areas. Rosebank, for example, has one, and urban design guidelines. So this I won't dwell on because I think the participants here are well aware of this, but we wanted to include this just to say that we don't want to do the SDF, in order to meet the goals of SPLUMA, or to create a planning system. We want to focus on the fact that we are trying to transform the city. I think that's also reflected in our name. The directorate I work for is called City Transformation and Spatial Planning, not just spatial planning. So we wanted to put this up to show that really our goal is to make these a reality on the ground and not to sort of tick boxes into SPLUMA. But they include spatial justice, spatial sustainability, efficiency, which I'll talk about quite a bit in terms of infrastructure, spatial resilience, and very importantly is good administration. Okay, so this is now just the current SDF and a very, very brief summary of what the SDF says. So the SDF highlights a number of key spatial challenges. These include spatial inequalities and the job housing mismatch. We're all very aware of this, which is a result of apartheid planning. And this really links to a lot of the others. So urban sprawl and fragmentation. So this arguably extends the job housing mismatch, keeps spreading the city and dividing job centers from housing centers. Exclusion and disconnection, again, linked to the two above. Inefficient residential densities and land use patterns. And this, I suppose all of these I'll actually talk about in the next slide, which is just a model of the city. And then importantly, increasing pressure on the natural environment. So this is a slide that I've presented, I feel like thousands of times, and I'm sure to most of you in the room, but I'll go through it very quickly again. When doing the SDF, we looked at the current sort of model of the city, if we could call it that, and we named it inverted polycentricity. And that's represented on the left-hand side here. And very quickly, there is an inner city core, which is fairly strong, but we believe it's not a strong enough form-giving center of the city. Secondly, and maybe one of the biggest problems we have, and at least in the context of the previous slide, the job housing mismatch. As we all know, apartheid planning created large dormitory townships on the outskirts of the city, and also intentionally limited jobs. So black people would have to live in an area, travel into previously white areas every day, work and shop in those areas, so pay tax in those areas and go back at night. And this is still very much seen today, where some of the highest densities we have, so this scale here is from, purple is high density, medium, low density suburban. Some of the highest densities we have are on outskirts of the city, and importantly don't have good job centers or very good connection to jobs. The next problem we see is that one of the assets in the city are the strong nodes that we have. So places like Rosebank, Sandton, Randburg, Midrand, in the south, even Lenasia. But these are generally not surrounded by high density residential areas. They're surrounded by density. So someone working in Sandton generally has to drive to Sandton or Rosebank or Midrand or any of those areas. And we believe that new housing opportunities should happen in and around those areas to create more of a mix of land uses. So I think I've covered that. Onto sort of the model that we'd like the city to transform into is a compact polycentric model of the city. And broadly, this involves strengthening the inner city as the core and serious form-giving heart of the city. The second one is where possible, and well, we have to sort of fight for this. I think this is probably the most important, and one of the things that we've struggled at the most post-apartheid is introduce significant to areas on the outskirts of the city. And I'll show you the map of the nodal review later, which, for example, introduces 2 significant new nodes in Soweto. Soweto, which is an area of 2 million people, there's no reason it shouldn't have one or more significant nodes such as Sandton and Rosebank within it. The next one is new housing opportunities we believe should be in and around job centers. So densify in and around areas that have concentrations of jobs, but that also includes other amenities, so schools, parks, healthcare facilities, etc. And very importantly, public transport. So you'll see this bit that's linking these sort of purple areas here broadly represents the BRT system and the Gautrain and the process system. So, you know, if you can't live near to where you work and go to school and go to the park and shop, the next best thing is to be able to live near to public transport that allows you to access all of those things. So this is the broad model of development. And again, as most of you know, if we were to summarize this, we're talking about infill and compaction, transit-oriented development, as I mentioned in the last slide, so developing around public transit infrastructure. And this is a very important one, I think, to note, is that what this relates to is brownfield rather than greenfield development. So that means developing existing urban within the city, rather than doing new township establishments on the outskirts of the city. And often these things do get confused. You know, people say we want to build a big new city on the outskirts, and we believe we're doing infill and compaction, and we believe it'll be dense and mixed use. But actually, we're talking about redeveloping existing parts of the city, and that relates very much to infrastructure and environmental concerns. We think that the infrastructure costs are huge for new developments on the outskirts of the city, as opposed to upgrading existing infrastructure. And also, we're using up limited sort of open green land on the outskirts of the city. And also, you know, people will be traveling long distances between these areas, so we'll have significant emissions. And then this is one I sort of want to discuss. I won't talk too much about it, but we've been looking at a bit of theory from the US, which has said, you know, housing supply in cities often gets suppressed by city policy. And we believe that's been the case in Joburg, where a lot of well-located areas, the policy says you can't densify in those areas. So sort of protect single residential land use rights. And by doing that, we believe that, we sort of stifle the market and stop the supply. And the nodal review and the inclusionary housing policy, both are examples of, and the scheme, I'll talk about it in a bit, but are all examples of how we're trying to lift some of the barriers to natural housing supply in the city in well-located areas. Okay, so these are just some slides that, some of the points that I've already made, but and just some of the ideas of infrastructure and some of the reasons that we're talking about infill and compaction rather than outward sprawl. And this is an analysis we did, I think last year sometime, and we wanted to measure and look at the effectiveness or the sort of the efficiency of infrastructure in the city. Now, data on infrastructure is a bit limited. Well, it exists, but we struggle to get access to it. So to measure 1 unit of infrastructure in the city, we used a proxy, which is a meter of road. So a meter of road can represent a unit of infrastructure because the sewage pipes, the water pipes, the electricity pipes, the road itself, the stormwater drainage are all underneath that piece of road. So we can use roads as an indicator of the quantity of infrastructure in the city. We then looked at all different areas in the city and measured how many meters of road there are per person, meters of road per capita. So you'll see, and this is just a selection of areas in the city that we chose for illustrative purposes. So on the extreme end, on this end over here, you'll see that areas like Dunkeld and Forest Town have almost 10 meters of road or 10 meters of infrastructure per person. On the other extreme end, so the two most dense parts of our city, which are Alex and Hillbrow, there's sort of 30 centimeters of road per person or 60 centimeters of road per person. And what we're trying to show with this is that there's very inefficient and very efficient uses of infrastructure. I think arguably an area like Hillbrow, which is probably denser than it was initially designed for, there's probably a bit of an overburden on infrastructure in an area like Hillbrow, but it does illustrate the point that there is an unequal distribution of infrastructure per person. And what we sort of think is somewhere more along sort of these sections over here are the areas that are most sustainable and most efficient. If you look at an area like Killarney, which is 1 meter of road per person, Deep Slurt again is maybe a bad example here because there isn't sufficient infrastructure. But areas like Westbury, Greater Soweto, we think these are now starting to become efficient sort of uses of infrastructure in the city. And if you just look at Killarney over here, so if we show the slide to people, they often say, oh, well, you know, Dunkeld and Forest Town pay the most rates and taxes, so it makes sense for them to have the most infrastructure, whereas some of these areas don't. We questioned that because that's an argument that comes up a lot. And we measured the rateable value per square meter in different suburbs in the city of Joburg. Just to show you quickly, the blue line here is the total. So we added up all the value of all the properties in an area and divided it by the area of that to give us a value per square kilometer. So that's the blue one. And then the green one is for those of you who get a municipal bill, you'll notice that the first 350,000 Rand of your value is free. So that's a sort of subsidy that the city gives you. So a property that is valued at less than 350,000 Rand won't pay any rates and taxes. So the green line takes that into account. So in Berea, there's a lot of flats, obviously, that are below that. But what you can see is that, you know, areas like Dunkeld, Houghton Estate, Parktown North, you know, are very comparable to an area like Berea, for example. And on the previous slide, you will have seen that Berea has a lot less infrastructure per capita that sort of pays a similar amount of rates and taxes per square kilometer to somewhere like Houghton Estate. And then if you look at somewhere like Killarney, where property prices are, it's a sort of middle income, high density part of the city generates huge amounts of rates and taxes here, coupled with very efficient infrastructure use. The previous slide was 1 meter of infrastructure capita, starts to make a lot of financial sense. So we think this is just an important argument to put forward. And with our finance department, we have been discussing this with them to show, you know, one of the very important things for a city to do is remain financially stable and viable. And we have to take these things into account to do that. Okay, sorry, I'm going a bit slowly now. I'll speed up a bit. Another bit of analysis we recently did was looking at the nodal review and the densities put forward in the nodal review, and just looking at the potential in the nodal review, how many people we could house without expanding the footprint of the city. So as I mentioned earlier, in brownfield only development, so that's existing urban in the city, so non-agricultural urban. And we did sort of 3 estimates. I can share all the details of this, but the high estimate, which I believe is sort of kind of realistic estimate based on the densities, says just within residential 1 stands in the city. So this didn't include anything except residential 1 stands. So for those of you who aren't planners, that is single houses. So in most suburban areas of the city, if we had to densify all of those, we could house more than 6 million people without expanding the footprint of the city. So we think there's huge potential. And this is just considering housing. It's not considering any other development. Just with regard to increasing housing supply in the city, I think, you know, we have already done some significant stuff, and we hope this will be implemented over time. But just some examples, the scheme, which was introduced in 2016, I think, or 2018, sorry, I forgot which one, changed all residential 1 stands in the city to be allowed 2 subsidiary dwelling units. And that was really to make it fair. The old Johannesburg scheme, just Johannesburg, so excluding Sandton and other areas, allowed that, but different parts of the city didn't allow that. What the scheme goes on to say is that these 2 subsidiary dwelling units, so two dwelling units over and above the primary house, can be divided into 3 rentable rooms each. So theoretically, you could have 6 rentable rooms and a main house on every single residential 1 stand in the city. And I know in a lot of Canadian cities, they're really looking at this kind of development. So not very intense development, quite sort of small scale development, as a way to densify the city. I've mentioned the nodal review and the inclusionary housing policy, which both seek to increase supply of housing in well-located areas. And then, you know, we can maybe discuss this, but there is a debate on whether supply creates low-income housing opportunities. And there's a critique of the inclusionary housing policy, which limits only the size of the inclusionary housing units and not the price of them. And the critique of this is really called supply skepticism, and sort of saying supply doesn't bring down the cost of housing. But we're sort of on the other side of the debate, that increasing housing supply, even if it is sort of at the higher end of the income spectrum, does reduce demand in the city, and it also does bring down the price of housing. And there's an interesting article we saw recently where a study in America said that even for every 100 even luxury condominiums that get built in American cities, creates opportunities for 46 low-income houses across the city. And that's basically because a family will move from where they currently live into the higher income new apartment, which creates a cascading effect down of creating new supply all the way down the market. And that's something that we hope will happen in the city. So just as a summary, this is the map of the SDF. I won't go through it in detail, but this is the sort of spatial representation of some of those models I was showing, and showing the areas where we'd like to focus development. Importantly too, the nodal review, which was adopted this year, which was really an update of the previous slide, tries to create this hierarchy of development in the city. So the inner city is red, is the highest intensity. Second are these orange areas, which are places like Midrand, Sandton, Randburg, Rosebank, areas along the mining belt, Roodepoort, 2 new nodes in Soweto, so Orlando, and an extended Jabulani node, and even Lenasia. So these are metropolitan nodes. Those are then surrounded by sort of relative high density residential areas with a mix of uses, and then it goes out into suburban areas and peri-urban areas. And you'll see that this sort of is a kind of almost a fractal kind of thing happens at all scales in the city. So, you know, most obvious here and going down as you go outward, but even in an area like Lenasia, that sort of hierarchy exists. For those of you who haven't looked at it, we have created an online map of the nodal review, and and this is the link here. I did share it in the abstract to this talk, so please go look at that. Okay, so that's basically what the SDF currently says. Very briefly here, what we want to do this year is review the SDF, as I've said. So we've gone to our political leadership and presented a very broad plan to them, which they have accepted. We're currently in this pre-consultation phase. So before we even start reviewing the draft, where we'd like to get feedback from various groups, we hope to finalize a draft by the end of this year. And also it's not an entire overhaul of the SDF. Like I said, we've made quite a lot of changes to it already. So we believe it can be fairly quickly done. Early next year, we're going to get authorization for formal public participation and then go into the formal public participation section. And we hope to have the draft done at the end of this financial year, which is June 2021, and then get it approved early in the next financial year. It might be a bit ambitious, but this is what we're going for currently. So just to sort of retouch on some of the things I've said, we are in an implementation phase of the SDF. So this review, what we wanted to do is improve the effectiveness of the document in achieving its goals. Like I already said, we want to incorporate changes made to the document so far, nodal review, inclusionary housing, a few smaller policies that we've done. So, for example, the plan formulation guidelines for communities who want to make their own plan. Currently isn't a formal document, but we'd like to formalize it through the SDF and incorporate spatial policies approved since 2016. We want to continue to improve our compliance with Section 21 of SPLUMA. So that's that long list of things that I read earlier. Like I said, update information like demographics, etc. And also introduce a concept that we're working on, which is a spatial plan management system. At the moment, we believe our plans aren't very accessible to the public. And sometimes even within the city, we struggle to properly articulate which plans are in place. So we want to build a formal database and plan management system that'll help to monitor that. And we've got funding from the Global Environment Facility to build that. So we're going to be building that platform, but also a new spatial data management system for the city. Some of the broad issues that, I don't want to sort of dictate what we're going to talk about, but some of the things that we've just thought we should discuss today. Firstly, the COVID pandemic. So I haven't mentioned that at all, and we haven't really given it much thought about what that really means for the SDF and how the SDF should consider that. We want to highlight the fact that a document like the SDF is always involved in trade-offs. So, these, for example, and some of the debates happening are mega human settlements being driven by provincial and national housing departments versus infill development. Related is obviously differing views between different spheres of government. Developers' views in certain areas versus residents' views, so someone who wants to build a 3-story block of flats versus the person who lives next door to that. This, I think, is an important one just to mention quickly is infill in existing suburbs in the city that might use up private green space. So what I'm talking about there is gardens, private gardens, but doing that will not spread the city. So we'll preserve peripheral green space. So that's a trade-off that we believe, this makes more sense than this, but often people who live in a leafy suburb won't see it that way and would prefer peripheral development. There are some issues to iron out in the SDF. So I already mentioned on the previous slide, the question of which plan prevails in certain area. And the spatial plan management system we've mentioned hopefully will address that. We've also, the nodal review, introduced a new concept of local plans expiring. We've got some urban development frameworks in the city that are sort of 20 years old that have never been rescinded. And we sort of have introduced this new concept of saying, if the SDF must be done every 5 years, so should all the plans in the city, or they should expire. There are currently a lot of plans in the city that either allow very high densities in areas where it doesn't really make sense, or that limit development in very well located areas. I think this is a big one, and I think one of the things I'm excited about talking to this group about is our limitations on approaches to informality. I think, by its very nature, government struggles to engage properly with informality, and a very formal document like the SDF or a formal thing like the land use scheme really struggles to engage with informality. So some input on that would be very useful, I think. Implementing the inclusionary housing policy and measuring its impact. And then, yeah, broadly, what we're just going to talk about is sort of, this isn't really for this group as much as for some of the other groups like developers. We don't really want to talk about specific applications or specific things, but more broad issues to do with the SDF. If anyone's got any points of clarity on the presentation, please raise those. Other than that, please raise your hands, and I think Margot will manage the comments. And it really isn't so much a question and answer session, but a discussion where people can raise issues and ideas for the SDF. So thank you very much.
Super, thanks so much, Jill. Very appreciated. Great, well, let's go into our discussion. I don't see any raised hands, but I would like to welcome and invite comments and questions. So let's have a look. Okay, I did see Ivan raised an issue in the questions. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, everybody. So Ivan raised a question in the chat. I would wonder if you'd like to actually raise it in the discussion. Ivan, I'd like to invite you to do that. And then, and also mentions Aerotropolis. So let's start with Ivan, if you're online. Oh, not sure if he's still there. Okay, basically the question that he raised was that says all very interesting, Dylan, but no mention of the president's new smart city or at Lanseria. It seems to be completely contradictory to all the principles of the existing and revised SDF. Surely we just can't ignore it. So I think that he responded a little bit more in terms of the mega project Lanseria questions that are coming up. I think that might be interesting, Dill. And then I think Anne, on top of that, says the Aerotropolis corridor also seems to contradict the principles. So it does seem to be a question of how to manage some of the contradictions around the other projects and programs that are in place at work. So I think if you could speak to that a little bit, Dylan. And then I have a question, which is, I find the, Graham's got a question, I'll come to you now. Which is, I find the idea of densification and infill fantastic, full support, but I do wonder exactly how are we going to entice either small-scale developers or even large-scale developers into these nodes and into these areas to develop in places that they haven't perhaps they had an interest in before. So that could be my question. Graham, let me come to you. You've got your hand up. Graham Gotts.
Thanks, Margot. And I too might have kids running in and interfering. Forgive me if that happened. So thanks, Dylan. Interesting as always. I obviously recognize there's difficulties around managing the strategic spatial interests of other players, national and provincial government in particular, and then navigating differential interests that might result from the development community contradicting what the city might be after. But I'm particularly interested in the debates that the city is having internally between differential interests that play out between different departments. And in particular through interviews that I've been doing, a note that's beginning to be struck by some people in the infrastructure domain that basically says the strategic emphasis on corridors of freedom and concentration and intensification of development along corridors of freedom, whatever you want to call them in their latter-day guise, has taken away from development in other parts of the city. And the phrase that's used is the rest of the city has suffered. And there's a big push at the moment to try to bring capital budget to express needs in other parts of the city that haven't been favored through the spatial plans of the past. And I'm really interested to hear to what extent those debates are playing out in a way that's that's possible to resolve, that keeps true to the principles of strategic spatial planning, rather than just the need wherever it is expressed will get some money, regardless of where that takes the development. Thanks, Dylan.
Super, thanks, Graham. Dylan, I think that gives you a few questions and comments to respond to, so let's start with that, and then we'll move to a few more comments and questions afterward.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, these are all great points to start off with. So Ivan, the first point, and it relates to some of the others as well, is the mention of the new smart city in Lanseria, and there are other examples in the city. For example, Southern Farms is a project that's being sort of discussed at the moment. And I'll be frank, a lot of these are directly not in line with what the spatial development framework is saying. And it is something that I raised in some of the trade-offs and some of the ways we have to manage development. There are different ways in which development is seen by different actors, but also, I think, importantly, by different spheres of government. I've said this in I think, even maybe the last phases of the city I spoke in, or similar forum. I think this often relates to scale. So, you know, for national government, if they look at places in the country that are where development should be prioritized, they say Gauteng, Cape Town, Durban, very broadly. If the provincial government, even in Joburg, in Gauteng, says where are the places we want to prioritize, they very broadly say Johannesburg, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni. Us, on the other hand, you know, looking at our scale of this much smaller area we're developing, go into more detail and say, and then redefine the areas of priority. So I think that's one of the reasons. But again, you know, I haven't got much proof about that. That's just a sort of gut feel. But something like the Lanseria megacity development, from this, so the SDF recognizes Lanseria as somewhere with potential. I think, unlike a lot of other quite peripheral developments, what Lanseria has got going for it is a serious economic idea to start off with, which is the airport. So at least it's got that. At least it's got some economic idea to start from. But beyond that, it has been quite a top-down approach that you know was basically introduced by in the President's State of the Nation address 2 years ago, and then has cascaded down to us. So we are engaging very much with that. And I think, you know, I don't know, I'd like everyone's opinion on how this can be practically managed. You know, our experience of saying, you know, we're just going to fight these things often just creates negative outcomes all around. It might just end up happening, and then us as the city will have had very little say in the development of this new city. But, you know, we have to also be honest about the fact that we don't believe it's in line with the SDF. So, and also looking at infrastructure costs, we think that, you know, the cost for these things, one of the problems is that a new city, you need to put all the infrastructure in at once. So you need all of the roads, all of the water, all of the electricity, a huge upfront cost that'll take years and years to start paying off. And even firstly in sort of financial returns, but in social returns as well. And one of the big arguments for infill is we believe if you were to spend that same amount of money, for example, in Soweto, it could be done incrementally. So individual pieces of infrastructure could be upgraded over time. It's not a sort of huge upfront cost. And each one of those pieces of infrastructure that gets upgraded starts having a financial return and a social return for the city immediately. But, you know, it's a big debate that we have to have. And it is sort of one of the trade-offs I mentioned. With the Aerotropolis corridor, and I'm not sure if you're talking about the same thing, but our Aerotropolis corridor going towards OR Tambo isn't so much a corridor all the way to OR Tambo. It's more of a corridor along points on the way to OR Tambo. You know, one of the if you land in OR Tambo with the Gautrain, you're basically landing in Sandton because you can get there in 20 minutes or whatever it is. So developing Sandton in connection and in the context of OR Tambo is really what our OR Tambo development corridor was talking about. We also believe, though, that even though some of those areas like Modderfontein, Frankenwald are fairly peripheral, if you're looking at Johannesburg, if you're looking at the context of the three metros, which are Joburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni, that's very central. And we do believe that that is an example of greenfield development in the city, which can be seen as infill in the broader context of the three metros. So Margot, I think your question is extremely important, and it is something that we discuss internally all the time. The fact that we've drawn a new orange node in Orlando doesn't mean that Standard Bank is going to go there and build a new office. And we really, so areas like Sandton and Rosebank that have a lot of momentum, a lot of demand, sort of do look after themselves in a way in terms of development. But other parts of the city, we really do have to entice development. And, the new Soweto plan is busy being done by colleagues of mine. And that's one of the big questions that they have. So I think Orlando is great and it's a good place to look at, but we do have to look into it in a lot more detail. There is some significant private investment there already. For example, Orlando Stadium's there, which is a multi-million rand investment by a private company, the Orlando Pirates. But we have to look at how do we get more private investment into those places. But also very importantly is, within Soweto, for example, but also other areas in the city, there's a lot of investment happening, especially relative to people's income. So people who do build backyard rooms are investing large proportions of their income or of their wealth into their properties. We don't think it's ideal the way it's happening at the moment. The densities are good. Backyarding is providing a huge cushion for the housing crisis in the city. But we think that development and then investment could be done a bit better. And we would like to learn how to engage with those markets to create more sustainable development. And then Graham, so I think this is key. I've already mentioned sort of differing views and possibly even tensions between different spheres of government, different departments, but certainly within the city administration itself, those differing views do exist. And I've already, Southern Farms, for example, is actually being driven by the departments within the city. And historically, there's been quite differing views between housing and planning, where planning has sort of said we should do this infill, more piecemeal development, and housing has gone more along the lines of national and provincial housing to large housing developments on the outskirts. I think with housing, we're coming a lot closer together. The new, I forgot what the acronym is, but the priority housing development areas that were announced recently by national government for countrywide. In Joburg, one of the notable things about them is that they cover the whole of Soweto, for example, the whole of the inner city, the whole of Alex. So they are looking very much, and I think, with some of our input, they are looking at more infill development. But your question about infrastructure is a very important one. And like I said with the SDF, the one thing is sort of putting in land use potential, but the other one is actually putting in infrastructure to allow it to work. And I don't know what the answer is to this. The city has got a 10 billion rand budget a year, so 10 billion rand by itself isn't that much. It puts together quite a lot of infrastructure, but in a very spread out way across the city. But over 40 years, that 10 billion rand budget can really start to have serious effects on changing the city. And that's what we have to, I think, start aligning properly. And I've actually never heard of this, what you bring up to say, some parts of the city almost feel neglected because areas like the Corridors of Freedom are getting new clinics and that sort of thing. But yeah, so it's interesting to consider. I don't know if I've answered your question, but thanks for the input.
Great, thanks, Dill. Alison, sorry, you said you couldn't put your hand up, but you do have a series of questions to ask. Would you like to ask them in person?
Yeah, Dylan, thanks for that. The one question I have, the existing SDF doesn't really say very much about the sort of peripheral areas that are already there. So places like Orange Farm, Luftering, that were created under various regimes, I'm sure not really consistent with the SDF and get called deprivation areas. But there isn't really, it doesn't say very much about what can and should happen in those areas. And, you know, the sort of studies of those areas do suggest that people feel quite spatially marginalized, transport isn't good, etc., etc. So I'm just wondering if if in the review it's not an area to be thought about a bit more, and if you have got any comments on that. And then the other question is, I suppose today we've been hearing about the Gauteng Township Economic Development Bill, and that's proposing, as I read it, almost a formalization of the informal in townships, and then how the city sees that with a whole set of land use, you know, another approach to land use management in that area. And yeah, if the SDF is going to speak to that as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Alison. I'm going to invite a couple more comments and questions before, so you can take them as a batch, Dylan. So Themba, you had your hand up, so let's go to you.
Thanks, Margot, and thank you, Dylan. I was interested in your question at the end of the presentation about how to sort of approach informality. And I sort of found it interesting in the SDF, the stuff about public space, but the discussion of informality doesn't seem to be as closely linked to the discussion on public space as I think is necessary, because a lot of, I guess, what we see as informality happens in or through public space. And I think it gets restricted through whether it's public or private management of public space. Various types of informality are restricted either through bylaws or different types of policing. So I wonder if you could just comment on that. And on the SDF, in terms of the mentions of public space in there, I thought there were some really interesting ideas, like demarcating selected streets for pedestrian-only movement, which seems like it could be a very valuable thing in the context of the lockdown. And then some areas of concern that should be addressed include the interface between public and private development, between built and unbuilt, the configuration of the street network, privatization and neglect of public space, configuration of public environment, as well as the quality and inequality of public environment investment. And I wonder if you have any more detail, or if there's been any more detailed thinking around that, whether that comes up instead in the strategic area frameworks, or if it's coming into the thinking for this review. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Themba. Appreciate it. Dylan, do you want to just respond to, I think, those three clusters of questions, the two from Alison and then the engagement from Themba?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alison and Themba. So yeah, one thing we have been discussing, and it's sort of related to what how I responded to Margot's question about how we get development going in peripheral areas. We have been having internal discussions where we've been quite critical about what the SDF says about deprivation areas or marginalized areas, and even sort of the terms that are used. Are they useful? You know, how could we possibly look at reconceptualizing these areas? So my colleague Bafana, who's got a particular interest in this, actually will be driving that section, and we will be looking at that. And I think that's very important. You know, we want to stress the fact that while we want to drive new development in a certain way, so we want new housing to not new housing developments not to repeat the mistakes of the past, to be isolated far away. So we want to densify in well-located areas. You know, Diepsloot exists and Orange Farm exists, and they will continue to grow and evolve. We shouldn't want to wish them away, or there's no way we can wish them away, and we have to think about how to integrate those as, you know, sustainable, livable parts of the city. So the first thing to do, and the SDF does say this, the first thing is to firstly connect them better. You know, in Orange Farm, I think from some research I saw, is the area with the highest structural unemployment in the city, where people can't afford to go look for jobs. So they've got no prospect of becoming employed. You know, there is a fairly good system in place, which is the process system. I mean, the hard infrastructure, but obviously it doesn't work very efficiently or work very well. So the first step is, I think, to get those systems working properly. But we mustn't forget that that was actually the apartheid plan, you know, to have peripheral areas with good transport where people can come and go. So a place like Orange Farm really does have to develop its own, you know, economic impetus over time, which, as we all know, is very difficult. The nodal review, what it did was it tried to look at potential in the city. And one of the things in terms of potential was access to jobs. So a lot of areas like Diepsloot, Orange Farm, parts of Ivory Park scored very poorly in that regard, because there just are very few jobs in those areas. So we created a zone called local economic development zones. And those are basically places that have high population densities. I forgot what, I think in the top 20% of population density in the city, but that aren't in the top 20% in terms of access to jobs. And the nodal review now allows for much more mixing of land uses and job creation there. But again, it doesn't, you know, unlike Rosebank and Sandton, where, you know, if we put these conditions in place, the market will take them up. It is quite difficult to get that development going in areas like Orange Farm. And it links quite closely then to Themba's point on informality. You know, we should, and we all know this, we should see it as a continuum, you know, so the informal economy is the economy. And how do we allow for the informal economy in an area like Orange Farm to formalize, and not formalize for the sake of formalization, but to become stronger over time and more meaningful? And again, I don't know if the SDF can necessarily even answer those questions. I don't know if I can, but, you know, so inputs would be very useful on how to do that. So Alison, your point about, sorry, I didn't quite get it properly about Gauteng's plans for economic growth. But if I can just say, I do think that we have to be realistic. You know, a document like the SDF, a planning document, can't solve all of the issues in society. And we have to, and I'm not sort of saying that as an excuse, I'm trying to be realistic to say we need significant economic policies in place that are going to assist the SDF, something like the SDF. You know, the current context we're living in, we all know is very dire. And how we get sort of economic growth going, you know, no one really has the answer to that. Sorry, I did miss the detail of what you were saying. I cut off for a second. So Themba, yeah, I think a lot of yours are points more than questions. You know, we'd welcome any input that you've got on all of these ideas. I think, you know, the one thing is to, and we're trying to think about how to manage this balance of what the city, so the city, us, the organization actually builds, and what the residents of the city build. So that's in terms of public space, in terms of actual developments, you know, converting public space into more sort of livable areas. So we have to find this balance of where we can and where it's feasible, sort of do public space upgrades, but in other areas, put in more sort of enabling mechanisms, you know, to allow for spaces to evolve and to allow for the people who live in the city to develop them. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Margaret.
Super, thanks, Dylan. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So Nick Buerter is asking and says that in the recent SA Cities conference, one presenter raised the issue of the failure of the land use management system in most South African cities, particularly around single land use schemes and zoning, and asks, are there any plans, are there any debates, discussions, thoughts around doing away with these overly restrictive systems in favor of a more dynamic or more flexible system, particularly those which will promote densification as party of the nodal review, as I assume as part of the nodal review, sorry. So that's a question from Nick. And then Hannah, I don't know, I can invite you to ask this question aloud if you'd like, otherwise I can read it out. Should I just read it? Okay, super. Okay, so Hannah says, my question involved a share of the result of a modeling of potential housing types that was done by consultants to the JDA last year, using student designs that were within the financial subsidies available for affordable housing. It was intended to showcase the then current SDF. The site is off Empire Road next to the flyover that becomes Barry Herzog. I'd be interested in your comments on the resulting quality of architecture and public space within the building units, collective areas and adjacent environments. I have an opinion, but as a mere architect, it would be interesting to know how this is seen through the eyes of planning. So that was, those were two questions from Nick and from Hannah. And then Sarah Charlton, I saw that your hand was up. Perhaps you'd like to ask your question now?
Thanks, Margot. Hi, Dylan. Thank you for that presentation. And I'm sorry, I've got a dog barking in the background. my question is about the sort of overall concept of transformation and spatial justice. And it relates to what you were saying just now about in future trying to avoid sort of peripheral housing development and really trying to encourage better located housing development and densification. So the first part of the question is, how low income do you envisage, or does the SDF envisage? How low would the income levels be facilitated or encouraged in well-located areas around Sandton, around Rosebank, or let's take Frankenwald as an example. And if we're talking about a large percentage of the city being incredibly low income, households being incredibly low income, and we're talking about a context of huge structural unemployment and poverty, you know, the likelihood is that people in that very low income bracket won't be getting jobs, won't be formally employed. And the kind of consequence of that is the likelihood of home-based enterprises, small-scale businesses, a lot of which in their current form are informal. And I know there's been some move by the city to sort of think differently about how these land uses might play out in areas that haven't been typically exposed to those kinds of activities. But I think some people will see it as a tension and that kind of activity, that kind of residential development coupled with economic development and small-scale microeconomic development is not really what's envisaged for these sorts of areas. So perhaps you could talk a bit more directly about the sort of nitty-gritty of what might be envisaged, what might be encouraged, and how that might be managed or facilitated. I hope my not very articulate question is clear. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Okay, I think, Dylan, you've got three quite substantial questions or comments. Do you want to deal with those first?
Sure, thanks, Margot. So Nick, yeah, I think this is a very interesting concept, and an ex-colleague of mine, Tabang Sitole, always brought this up and said, why are we messing around with an SDF? Why don't we just change the scheme? So what the SDF says is that this is the idea about how we change land use in the city, but the scheme is still a different thing, and everyone has to come one property at a time and rezone to achieve the SDF. And he was saying, why don't we just do that? So there's lots of reasons that get put forward. You know, the one big one is infrastructure. Every single application we need to, and we're supposed to assess if there's infrastructure in place to allow that to happen. But just so some of the thinking that's happened around this, the corridors of freedom, both the Louis Botha corridor of freedom introduced Orange Grove as one of these areas where the city would do a bulk rezoning of the whole place. So to what the plan is saying, so the densities, the mix of uses, etc. Individual property owners would then at any time be able to just turn on those rights. So it wouldn't happen automatically, because if you live in a single house and it's rezoned overnight to business 3, your rates and taxes will go up, hugely, all sorts of problems. But the idea was that you could turn on those rights at some stage and then go ahead and develop. It never happened because the infrastructure wasn't in place. There were other complications with the whole process. But what the scheme did is it did take up some of those ideas, even though it didn't it definitely didn't go all the way. But the one example I already mentioned was introducing subsidiary dwelling units to every residential one stand in the city. And that was done overnight. And every Res 1 stand in the city now does have those rights in place. Some other things which, again, aren't quite as far as you're suggesting, but, and this relates a bit to Sarah's question as well. The new scheme and the bylaw softened the rules for home-based enterprise and home-based shops. And another one, but I forgot what it is. But basically, a house that has a small shop within it can now much more easily get formal rights to do that. So not through a consent use, but just a consent application, which is just a letter from the city saying you can run that, and then there's some rules attached to it. So, I think we are moving in that direction. But these rules and regulations do take a long time to evolve. But I do think it is very interesting to consider that sort of thing. I think especially in the context of informality. If you look at somewhere like Alex, it's very difficult to even look at the scheme and then look at what's on the ground in Alex, because they don't talk to one another. And if the scheme is totally disregarded in an area, what's the point of it? We should possibly rethink of, what the rules are in an area like Alex in terms of development. So Hannah, I'm sorry, I don't know which one you're talking about. So maybe you can email me that and we can have a discussion on that, but I don't actually know exactly which project you're talking about. And Sarah, so I sort of have discussed a bit of this. And I think it is interesting to look at, like you say, the reality is, you started by asking how low in terms of income are we going to go? And with 30% of people unemployed, we actually need free housing. But the question is, how do we finance that? And there's no sort of easy answer for that, whether it's government financing it, whether it's requirements by the private sector to develop a certain amount of affordable housing. If we squeeze the private sector too much, we're going to stop development altogether, and that's a negative thing for the city because it reduces housing supply and that sort of thing. So I don't have the answer to that, but yeah, it goes as low as possible. And another thing we have been considering is the idea of, one of the big objections we got to inclusionary housing was developers, especially housing developers, saying we're putting a burden on housing developers to help with what they argue was the responsibility of government. But we have no similar requirement for commercial or industrial developers. So people who are developing commercial, retail, industrial property, we could introduce rules there where spaces have to be made available for lower income, less formal, smaller businesses, etc. And as to the sort of nitty gritty, so this now is the next point. The local economic development zone in the SDF, which is, I mentioned areas like sort of Deep Sloot, a lot of peripheral areas. But then the general urban zone as well, which includes areas like Melrose, Dunkeld, Saxonwald, parts of Parktown North, etc. Those areas all sort of say 50% of buildings, up to 50% of buildings can be for non-residential uses. So we do see quite an intense mix of uses in these areas. And, we haven't seen much take up of it yet. So I can't really talk to the nitty gritty of and what it'll look like. But I do think it will be quite interesting and not necessarily always very neat.
No, probably not very neat. Okay, thanks, Still. There's a comment in the chat from Carmel and a question, who's concerned about the power dynamics within the SDF. And she says, particularly if we're talking about inclusivity and housing, where existing property owners and ratepayers often use their disproportionate power compared to future residents to prevent challenge the city's housing initiatives for a range of reasons. For example, the efforts of Nora to oppose the city's plans for inclusive housing developments around the Patterson Park area. I think there is an underlying assumption of social cohesion that will facilitate inclusivity amongst stakeholders, despite the fact that I'm sure all of us know that not to be necessarily true right now. Can the SDF and its related policies better target these unequal distributions of power that hinder inclusivities in some cases? Interesting. Okay, so there is that. Then there's Kamal. There were a couple of comebacks, and Alison, I'll just invite you to make your comment, your question in person. Sorry,
okay.
Alison. There we are.
Sorry, Dylan, if I wasn't clear. There's this process where Gauteng provincial government is put forward a township economic development bill, and that seems to talk about formalizing pretty much all, I think, informal economic activities, and it also seems to propose generic regulations for those areas that are quite simple and different from what operates in the rest of the city and what operates there. And I just wondered if the review of the SDF is going to think about that, or it started to think about that, and what your comments might be on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison. And then we have a hand up. So Ivan, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Dylan, for the presentation. I've got a fairly general comment, and that is that, you know, the emphasis has been on preparing a plan, a document that will stand the test of time. But it strikes me, listening to the conversation, that, you know, probably much more important than the plan itself are all the procedures that surround it, starting from the consultation through to all sorts of engagements and follow through, that will be much more important than the document itself, to give it traction, at one extreme to negotiate with these strong market areas, developers in the strong market areas, to get concessions from them. At the other extreme, to build capacity in townships and other areas, to have planners on the ground actually working with people, developers and other people doing projects. So I wonder whether that emphasis is whether you support that point, that, you know, the plan itself is only the tip of the iceberg, really, that to get the change, what you're talking about is extremely ambitious. You've identified at least half a dozen incredibly ambitious changes that the city wants to see in the way things happen. But the plan itself will make little difference. I would suspect the real difference will become from actually engaging with other stakeholders, persuading key partners in other parts of government that they, you know, need to support the principles of the plan, persuading private developers to do different things. Isn't that far more important? And I don't know what the capacity is of the city in terms of actually the hard work of persuading and negotiating. I suspect it's limited, in which case you will have to make some very difficult choices about which are the most important changes that you want to see. Is it formalizing backyard property? Is it winning some minor concessions from developers around Sandton? Is it persuading property owners on large plots that they need to allow intensification of their sites? These are all very, very challenging objectives. You can't possibly achieve all of them. I'm just wondering whether you understand the importance of making really hard choices about what things are most important in the long term to transform the city's trajectory.
Okay, thanks, Ivan, for those very challenging comments. Dylan, I'll let you have a go at those three questions, and then we'll see if we'll take another few rounds.
All right, great. Thank you, Margot. So I think a lot of these are actually comments really more than questions, more in the sense that, you know, I don't think I can answer them. So Carmel, I think this idea of power dynamics is very important, and it plays out in so many different ways. You know, even one of the big ways it plays out that we've noticed is the public participation we do, and the people who do comment and the people who do engage with, it's dominated by wealthy, educated people. And you know, it's for, I think, a number of reasons, but the one is that those people have time to do it. With this group, a lot of you, it's your profession to sort of be involved in this sort of thing. But we really do struggle to get any meaningful engagement, especially at scale, something like the SDF, looking at the whole city from poorer communities. And I do think that does, you know, so these power dynamics play out all the time. You asked if the SDF can address this. I don't think it necessarily can, you know, but maybe through what sort of Ivan was talking about, you know, deeper thinking about what the document is and what it does and what it represents, actually, what the sort of work in the background, the negotiations, the sort of bigger ideas and the other mechanisms that must happen in the background. You know, I think it can influence some of that, but I think it's very important for us to consider. Alison, so I think that's very interesting. We'll definitely get that and read it and consider it. I think it's very important, so thank you very much. And Ivan, yeah, so I agree with you. Sort of what you've more eloquently put it when I was talking about the principles of Spluma and saying what we're actually trying to achieve. We're not trying to achieve making a plan or trying to achieve a plan that will be implemented. That's not our goal. Our goal is to try and transform the city. And, you know, I have learned, and we've all learned in the city, that it is this huge, big beast, and it's incredibly complex and multifaceted. You know, I was in a meeting with National Housing today, and I, you know, struggled to even relate to some of the things that were being spoken about, and how they could relate to the city of Joburg and be implemented on the ground. But I agree with you. We do have to sort of treat this SDF as a sort of almost a statement and a goal that does talk about some very practical things, but then do a huge amount of work on top of this and in the background to make it happen. But also any suggestions that anyone's got on how we can better do this, I think would be very useful. So yeah, thanks.
Super, thanks. There's actually a very interesting chat around enabling mechanisms around informality that's going on in the chat, which I think is worth looking at as well. Trying to think about the minimal kind of infrastructure that might be needed to assist in informal enterprises. So that's quite an interesting piece going on there. Are there any other hands or questions or comments that I may have missed? So I'm trying to keep track, but if I have missed anything, please let me know. Just give me a shout out. Marianne, are you coming online to say something? Sorry, I just see a camera. No, okay, that's gone off. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Sarah, is your hand up again, or is it from the first time? Okay, now it's down. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. I was just checking. All right. I don't see any new questions or comments that I can see. So I think I'm just going to wrap it up there, if that's okay, Dylan. I'm hoping that you got some constructive comments out of it, but I suspect that people will need time to process some of the suggestions, and I assume that they can come back to you with further comments and recommendations or points of discussion in the future. Is that correct, Dil? Could people still come back to you?
Yes. So, yeah, firstly, thanks very much, Margot, and thanks very much, everybody, for your very useful and interesting. Like I say, we don't pretend to have all the answers, and added to what Margot is saying, if anything ever comes up about what you think we should consider in taking this SDF forward, or like Ivan said, sort of full suite of spatial interventions that the city does, you can email me at any time. And we're also very happy to have one-on-one meetings to discuss individual points. Already, from some of the meetings we've already had, we've got sort of an urban agriculture meeting set up. Some developers want to meet about specific things that don't always work well in big meetings like this. So anyone who is interested in engaging on any point going forward, please do contact me.
Super. Thanks so much, Dylan. Really appreciate it. Thank you for a really interesting presentation, and I'm sure we'll be engaging further on it in the next while. I'd just like to make a couple of announcements that we're having a series of ad hoc faces of the cities and events over the next while. The next one is going to be, if you look at your chat, Children as Urban Citizens in Crisis and Beyond, which is on Monday the 12th between 10 and 4 o'clock. And it's being advertised at the moment, but if you'd like further details, you're welcome to contact myself or Tammy Jazilia from our organization. And then Phil's just also saying, please do have a look at the program for the Urban Festival, which is being run by another number of partners, including the South African Cities Network. It's got lots of exciting things going on. And we're involved particularly in a number of the sessions. First, there'll be the compelling documentary Hutchinson Shunted, which will be available on YouTube coming this Sunday, the 4th of October, and that will be followed by a panel discussion with the filmmakers Loreen Platsky and Eric Miller, in discussion with Alison Todis and Phil Harrison. So the link for that will be made available quite soon. Second, there's also an exciting full-day workshop on Monday, the 12th of October. Sorry, I've told you about that as well. That's the Children in Crisis with a number of partners. And then third, there will be a, sorry, I'm just trying to find myself. Beg your pardon. There'll be a discussion with Edgar Peterson and Phil Harrison. We'll host Urban Conversations 3 on mega projects and international cases, and that will be on the 19th of October between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock. So please do have a look at the program. There are a whole host of interesting things that are going on, many of which our partners from the faces are involved with, but there are a whole lot of other things. So we hope to see you there. Thank you so much, Dylan. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for attending and contributing to this discussion. Take care. Go well. Bye.
That went really well.
Yeah, no, that sounds fine.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Hi, Margot.
Hi, Andy.
Hi,
How are
Lenny.
you?
Hi, Garth.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Thanks, Dylan.
I'm trying to get to my camera, actually. Yeah, here it is. Yeah.
There we go. Thanks, Bill.
Hi, Dylan. It's good to see you.
Hi, Ali. How are you? Yeah, you too.
Fine. How are you keeping?
Yeah. I'm happy about my hair. Last time I had this, I was one of your students.
No, I think it was a bit thicker than that.
My wife told me my hair is very thick on the sides and the back.
Yeah.